Great pleasure to introduce Gwythian Prins. He is the Emeritus Research Professor at the London School of Economics, where he established the Mackinder program for the study of long-wave events in honor of the school's early director. Since Putin's war began in Ukraine, he has been serving as one of the MOD's defense opinion leaders. Before retirement, he was Alliance Research Professor jointly at Columbia University in New York City and the LSE. But for most of his university career, he was a fellow and the director of studies in history at Emmanuel College and university lecturer in politics, University of Cambridge. Professor Prins directed the Cambridge military education programs in the 1980s, and he taught at every level of British military education for all services. He is an honorary member of the Royal College of Defense Studies. From 2011 until its closure, he served on the strategy advisory panel of the British Chiefs of the Defense Staff. He was thereafter a founding member of the Royal Marines Advisory Group and is an honorary member of His Majesty's Royal Marines. His many publications range from an award-winning history of Western Zambia to books and essays on medical anthropology, social epidemiology of AIDS and TB, energy and environmental policy, geopolitics, of course, principles of strategy, the ethics of war, military history, naval issues, and assessment methodology for coping with risk and uncertainty, the EU, and contemporary security issues. Professor Prins is currently the editor of a book in progress, Geopolitics for Hard Times. And with that, the floor is yours, Professor Prins. Please begin.
Aspects of the four-part series, which I was commissioned to write for the 100 days since 710, will give us a little bit of a starting point. And I'm not going to assume that everyone, or indeed anyone, has read any of that. I shall dip and mix, but you, I think, have references from the organizers if you want to look at those essays later. This talk is called Double Helix over Gaza, but in fact, it is basically not going to be about Gaza. It's going to be about geopolitics for hard times. Historical analogies are inevitable and not wrong unless they are overdetermined. And so the rhyme of history, in Mark Twain's felicitous phrase, the rhyme of history, I suggest, is less for today with 1903 to 13 or 1932 to 39, much more with the 7 Years' War in the middle of the 18th century, from 1756 to 1763. And the reasons for that I indicated in the short intro, which is on the website, and we'll come to it at the end of the talk. The shape of this talk is quite simple. There are two concentric circles, which I will discuss, first local, then global. And then I'm going to touch on some salient aspects, some of which are new, some of which are old, which arise to help frame practical thinking about Gaza and what's going on there and what it might mean, and what it tells us or points to in analysis of the fast evolving world crisis, which we now all inhabit. So turning to the local context first, the double helix of history, the DNA of living memory. Well, the double helix is the relationship between what actually happened in history and what people believe happened in history. And the most magnificent exposition of the use of that is in this book, which has just appeared in its very large second edition, and which I warmly recommend by a friend of many of us, Robert Toombs, and it is entitled The English and Their History, signaling the double helix in the nature of the title. The point that we're going to explore is what happens when those two parts, those two elements of the helix are pulled apart. And I'm going to suggest that dark forces often emerge. There were three facets in my four-part essay. historical, ethical, and legal. And I'm going to dip a little into principally the historical and the legal. All of them, all three aspects combined in the events of the 7th of October to make it such a hinge of history. In the Middle East, there are contested and irreconcilable historical narratives. People believe entirely irreconcilable things. They clash. And what I did on the historical aspect of those essays was simply to remind of the actual and often overlooked empirical history of whose land the land of Israel actually is. And it's always worth remembering that it has been thrice legitimate Jewish land, first by original patrimony, secondly by international mandate, notably in July of 1922, the League of Nations mandate to the British, and then by right of conquest several times, 1948, 1967, 1973. And the line which I particularly wanted to remind people of, and I'll remind you of here, is the one which leads directly from the Nazis, from the Einsatzgruppen to Hamas. It's uncontroversial historically, and it's direct. And an important agent in that articulation is Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, he who spent the Second World War living as a pensioner of the Nazi state in Berlin, and who on the 28th of November 1941 went to a meeting at which we understand that lemonade was drunk because Hitler objected to the smell of coffee, with Hitler, in which the Grand Mufti requested, in effect, but failed to receive from Hitler, a written counter-Balfour declaration. He was given verbal comfort by the Führer and only eventually received what he sought in the form of a telegram from Himmler called the 26th anniversary of the declaration, the Balfour Declaration, at a protest rally, so-called, which the Nazis arranged for the Grand Mufti and for Muslims invited from all over the world in the Luftwaffe Hall in Berlin. This telegram said, and I quote from it, that the firm foundation of the natural alliance between National Socialist Greater Germany and the freedom-loving Muslims of the whole world includes a special sympathy for the struggle of the freedom-loving Arabs, foremost in Palestine against the Jewish intruders. And Haj Amin was, of course, delighted, and thereafter helped to raise a Bosnian Muslim 13th Waffen Mountain Division of the SS. His most important action, arguably, in his rather strange career was probably in 1947 when he led the Arab contingents in rejection of the first offer of a two-state solution in the contested lands of the Middle East. A two-state solution that was, you may remember, offered by Ben Gurion and the founders of Israel rather reluctantly in 1947. Al-Hajj, the Grand Mufti, was not alone in the closeness of his anti-Semitism to that of the Nazis. It was shared by Hassan al-Banna, by Said Qutb and the Muslim Brotherhood. It was all from the same root. And the Grand Mufti's secretary, by the way, was the person who wrote the PLO's charter, and so forth. Now, that foundation history helps to explain why no two-state solution was, as we now look back, perhaps sadly, ever possible, and how the Palestinian imagined community, to borrow Benedict Anderson's term, that was weaponized from the mid-1960s, combined anti-Semitism with opposition to the existence of Israel in any form, to a degree that now, in the last 6 months, is being generally understood across Israeli society. It helps to explain the special sadism that was seen in attacking the Israeli peace activists in their kibbutzim and at the Nova Peace Festival on the 7th of October last. It helps to explain the unrestrained violence that was visited on the victims It helps to explain the classic inversion, which was helped by the general wokery that has now polluted the West, which I shall come to later. Hamas is flagrant in its breach of operative international law. I emphasize operative to distinguish it from performative international law, because in my book, the international law that matters is Geneva 4, in particular of the 12th of August 1949, protection of civilians in time of war, and most especially within Geneva 4, the key article, which is 147, which prohibits the willful killing, torture, and inhumane treatment of civilians or the taking of hostages. And yet, in a hugely successful information war, of which the Ayatollah recently boasted, and it was so reported in the press, and he's not wrong, Western street protesters, aided by agents provocateurs, have come to believe that the victim of genocide, the people for whom the Genocide Convention was originally drafted, are in fact the perpetrators of genocide, which makes it therefore necessary for us to remember the distasteful but actual ratios in the conduct of urban warfare. The kill ratio in urban warfare since the end of the Second World War is generally reckoned by military authorities to be somewhere between 7-to-1 and 9-to-1, 7 civilians for each combatant. By way of comparison, the United States and the United Kingdom in the Iraq operations achieved a ratio of much better than that, of somewhere between 3-to-1 and 5-to-1. But Operation Swords of Iron, which the IDF is currently conducting in Gaza, has, by a margin, achieved better than that. If you take the Hamas Ministry of Health provided figures and the numbers of confirmed Hamas terrorists killed from the IDF and put them together, you have a ratio of between 1-to-1 and 1-to-1.5. So this is an operation that has been astonishingly sparing of civilian life, especially in circumstances where the IDF is being required to fight, as in some of the worst battles of the First World War, not only on the ground, but below the ground. In the final part of that 4-part essay series, I argued that in the paradoxical logic of war, the safest and arguably the most humane response to such unconditional hostility, which cannot be negotiated with, is escalation on our terms. That's escalation both within Gaza, as I think the IDF will clearly soon be doing, and regionally, to halt the controlling hand of the Ayatollahs of Tehran. And that's especially so after the 13th of April and the combined drone and cruise and ballistic missile direct attack on Israel. And this episode is our transition event, if you like, from the regional to the global circle of scale. After the geostrategic weakness that was demonstrated by President Obama's JPCOA, the attempt to provide a negotiated framework for the control, possibly reduction, of Iranian nuclear capability, followed by the bungling disaster of Biden's scuttle out of Afghanistan between the 14th and the 31st of August 2021, which is widely seen as firing the starting gun for Putin to invade Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022, it's frankly surprising that the West has any allies in the Middle Eastern region at all, and yet it has. Obama's manifest weakness was corrected first by withdrawal from the JPCOA by the following administration, then by the targeted assassination of the IRGC commander Qasem Soleimani on the 3rd of January 2020, which was followed by the signature of the Abraham Accords between Israel and Bahrain on the one hand and Israel and the UAE on the other on 15th of September of that same year, with the prospect of others to follow. Iran manifestly feared the prospect of the most important rapprochement that might occur within that diplomatic process, which would be a formal rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And if preventing this was one of the objectives behind the 13th of April, well, plainly it didn't work. Because if we look with a military eye at what actually happened on that extraordinary Saturday night, we see that the operative Air Force coalition placed United States Navy Super Hornets over Israel, RAF Typhoons over Syria, Jordanian Air Force planes intercepting Iranian drones over Jordan and parts of Iraq, and perhaps most significantly, Saudi Arabian Air Force aircraft intercepting drones as well, all of them from the shared CENTCOM common air picture, which is essential in air operations to make sure that you don't get so-called blue-on-blue collisions and conflicts. And perhaps most incredibly, with the air tasking coalition, as I understand it from colleagues of mine who know more about these things than I, being led from the Kyria by the Israel Air Force, of all of those forces. So this means that the Abraham Accords are alive in deeds, if not in words. Which takes us now to the global circle. And I think it's time to join up a few more dots. And that was the title of an essay which I published also with Gatestone on the 13th of June 2021, which summarized the state then, which is now much further advanced, in Sino-Iranian material cooperation. President Xi Jinping began this rapprochement on his state visit to Iran in 2016. And that in itself was a departure from the policy, the foreign policy profile of both of his immediate successors. And a useful guide to this, I find, is to go back to a document from the 5th century BC, the so-called 36 stratagems from the era of the Warring States. It's a manuscript which is a little older than Sun Tzu's Art of War. And I think it's an essential guide in trying to understand Chinese geostrategy for 2024. The first of the 36 stratagems, and forgive me if you're all familiar with these, but for those who aren't, I'll just run through them. The first one says, deceive the heavens to cross the sea. And that describes precisely the strategy that was followed by Hu Jintao, by other predecessors, indeed by all up until Xi Jinping. In other words, move stealthily. Don't let your enemy see what you are doing. Xi Jinping has chosen to do something completely different and new. And the 5th plenum text of October 2020 set out very clearly a strategy to 2035 for the People's Republic. And it told the Chinese people in terms to prepare for war. But I think what's noteworthy for us is that Xi Jinping's strategy is clearly mindful of the 3rd chapter of Sun Tzu in The Art of War. And there he writes, if I may remind you, and I quote, to fight and conquer in all your battles is not supreme excellence. Supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. And thus, going more deeply into the 36 stratagems, to employ 2 of the so-called war winning and 2 of the so-called enemy dealing of the stratagems. And they are respectively, kill with a borrowed sword. Translated into modern idiom, that means use our means taken into your hands to kill us, steal our intellectual property, steal our understanding on how to build hypersonic weapons. I'm sure many people attending will be well familiar with the now shocking and emerging and enlarging literature on the scale of successful subversion that has taken place in exactly this way. Here in London, a colleague, Dr. Radomir Tylcott, who is now the director of the Legatum Institute, conducted a piece of frankly shocking research, shocking in what it revealed, when 3 years ago he looked into the degree of penetration of the British defense research establishments, in which I had some role in my own career, by mainland Chinese people. It's well known the degree to which they have swept through British universities, but the roles which they have been able to take up within classified areas within our defense research community are frankly astonishing. I'll just give you one example. Rado discovered that in the atomic weapons research establishment, which is where we design and maintain our nuclear warheads, there is a particular facility which has both a design and a wider function, which is a high energy laser called Diamond Light. It's one of the most highly classified of the systems that operate at AWRE. And there was a mainland Chinese Ph.D. person inside Diamond Light. The second of the 36 that is relevant to understanding Xi Jinping's more open strategy says that you should loot a burning house. In other words, you should exploit your enemy's misfortunes. And that's obviously excellent advice in any war, but it's uncomfortable advice when we're on the burning house end of that particular image. The third, which is relevant, says that you should hide a knife behind a smile. In other words, conceal your hostility behind seeming cooperation. And this is, ladies and gentlemen, the basis of what's often described as ghost attack. This is the technique of the leading agency of the Chinese Communist state that is pointed towards us, the United Front Work Department. It combines with the final one of the 36, which I'll mention for you, which tells to, and I quote, "Let the enemy's own spies sow discord in the enemy's camp." That means subversion. This means active measures. It means propaganda. It means, more specifically in our societies, on both sides of the Atlantic, recruitment of our own youth in order to morally disarm our own societies. And hence my use or my preference for the historical analogy with the 7 Years' War, because that, as you will recall, was a world war which was simultaneously of many different theaters and many different modes of action. And the modes of action which we now perforce must engage in, these are no choices of ours, they're the choices of our competitors and enemies, are first of all hot war. Hot war because Biden's Afghan withdrawal begat the invasion of Ukraine. It's probable, I hear from experts deeper in these matters than I, that Iran's fear of the Abraham Accords may have caused them to let loose their proxies. Secondly, there is Cold War, which means encouraging economic dependence on China. And this has proved to be spectacularly successful because it's been extremely easy during the period since we in the West engaged, and particularly in this country under our previous Prime Minister, Mr. now Lord Cameron, and his then Chancellor of the Exchequer, in what they described rather grandiosely as a golden age, a new golden age of relationships between Britain and China. But China has also, and this goes back to what they've done with Iran, because Iran is in many ways the telephone exchange linking together all these theaters of war, Russia, the Middle East, and potentially the South China Sea, and we can come to that in discussion. I'm not going to go into that during this talk. I want quickly now to bring the threads together. But what the Iranians have done is industriously to work to reorient flows of firm power energy, by which I mean oil and gas, away from established pipelines and shipping routes which carry those fuels from the Middle East to Japan, North America, and Europe, away from them to Russia, and with new pipelines being constructed to enable China to take Iranian oil and gas and then transship into ships. So this is pipeline warfare. All this, in my opinion, arises from the crass error of what some economists call 12-11 in a deliberate echo of 9-11. Sorry, I got that the wrong way around. 11-12. 11-12, it was the 11th of December. And that was the date in 2021 when we unwisely allowed the People's Republic of China into the World Trade Organization, thinking charmingly but naively that doing this would somehow enable the PRC to normalize itself to our norms, our systems, our beliefs. That certainly hasn't been the record of what has happened. Thirdly, there is grey war. Grey war I've touched upon a little already in the illustration which I gave you from Rado's work. Massive theft, systematic theft of intellectual property, massive infiltration of Western institutions, universities, and particularly science institutions. And then on top of that, offensive cyber and information warfare. They are different for those not versed in these things. Cyber warfare is breaking into people's electronic systems, making things happen that shouldn't otherwise happen. Information warfare is often using electronic means in order to change the way that people perceive and think. One of the most interesting and powerful of China's instruments of this sort is the app used by many, many young people called TikTok. You may know there is a considerable debate going on now in some countries about whether TikTok should be actively banned. But I'm afraid that this is closing the stable door long after the horse has bolted. But the interesting thing about TikTok, if you talk to people expert in artificial intelligence and in classic intelligence work, is what its function may well have been. And its function is that by providing a platform on which children can share themselves doing silly little dances, what they do not understand is that they are also sharing not only little dances with each other, but they are sharing largely Caucasian facial recognition imagery with Chinese data banks so that they can train their AI on our features, just as they have very successfully already done on Asian features. In other words, it's a free gift of important electronic intelligence information. Above all, I would suggest, has been the success of CRINK. It's a horrible acronym, but it's accurate. China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, in encouraging our societies to self-harm, and to do this by using the magic weapon, as Xi Jinping called it, of the United Front Work Department to assist us in those parts of our societies which conduct certain activities to self-harm. And thus, since 9/11, we have seen sequentially and then latterly simultaneously a range of activities, all of which have been to a lesser or greater degree objects of interest to the FSB, to the United Front Work Department, and have been exploited in order to encourage the depth and the breadth of their activities within our societies. And in order, chronologically, there were first the anti-war movements, which accompanied the Western operations in Iraq and then twice in Afghanistan. There have been the episodes of the, in inverted commas, climate crisis movements. There have been sporadic anti-Israel demonstrations, sporadic until they became permanent and venomous after 7/10. There's been the astonishing appearance of a major movement of social importance from the tragic condition of gender dysmorphia, which in previous medical literature is thought to affect well less than 1% of the population. And then, of course, familiar to all, after the murder of Mr. Floyd, the sudden emergence of Black Lives Matter, of wokery in all its different forms, and for those of us who are historians, the attempt universally now to demonize the imperial history of the West. The success that our enemies combined in CRINK have had in this grave warfare is, it must be admitted, spectacular. Spectacular in the specifics and in the general. And I think this would come as no great surprise to Halford Mackinder and to the others of the coefficients, notably Julian Corbett in around about 1904, who, as many among our number will know, were actually, when you read what they actually said, extremely interested in the ideological reflexes of geopolitics. They were not geographical determinists. It's a gross boundarization to suggest that that was so. And both of those scholars wrote intelligently on the formation of culture. And that takes us back at the end of these remarks to Gaza. Because what seems to have happened in the last 6 months is that all the self-harming movements, which I've just mentioned, they've all somehow combined. And they've combined perhaps because they share similar belief patterns. They are, in the taxonomy of belief systems, cults. Cults, as first defined in one of the first and the greatest texts, one of the foundation texts of modern anthropology, in fact, Sir Edward Tyler's Primitive Culture of 1871, in which he described what modern anthropologists of religion have named blocks to falsifiability. These are mental devices whereby you can always find a way to disqualify from consideration any critique based on evidence which does not conform to the coherent and internally consistent belief structure that you have, which is held within a shell, as it were, a shell which is hard because it's impervious to critique, but is actually quite brittle, just like an eggshell. So that if it actually is broken, then the person whose mind is inhabited by a cult-like belief can quickly experience personal and psychological disintegration. Cults have been studied not only in universities by anthropologists, they've also been studied by intelligence services around the Western world. And in unclassified studies on these matters, there is interesting consensus on what is described as the dwell time within a cult-like belief. It's very important for intelligence services because if you're tracking terrorists, and particularly unconditional terrorists, like, for example, Hamas terrorists, you need to know for how long, roughly, an individual will be completely consumed in all their waking hours by the belief that they have. And the rule of thumb estimate is that people, normal people with normal mental functions, can inhabit a cult-like belief for a maximum of about 2 years. After which, if they continue, then they become dissociated, they begin to have clinically definable psychological sequelae. But the luxury beliefs, the Veblen goods, as I described them when I was talking about this phenomenon in relation to net zero, in an essay I published in 2021 called The Worm in the Rose, which you might find of interest if you want to look it up. What is worth noting is that all these recent cults have fused into a sort of gross anti-Semitism dressed up as Israelophobia. And it has actually quite direct historical resonance. In Weimar Germany, the universities, do recall, were absolutely in the forefront. And so the pictures which I saw when I was in Washington last weekend, with Len and with others on this call, coming from Columbia, from the Butler lawn, on which my office when I was in Columbia used to look out, and from UCLA, these could have been almost directly transposed from lines of Nazi students who were actively ejecting Jews from German universities in the early 1930s. There is a big difference, and it's the big difference upon which I want to move towards my conclusion. The big difference is that I think that China has had an enormous stroke of luck. The stroke of luck was the release, by means which I think none of us can definitively say we can explain, of what we certainly can now, beyond reasonable doubt, identify as a chimeric virus, the COVID virus, which escaped from the Wuhan laboratory somehow or another. Chimeric because it's a man-made virus. It's a joint project between Wuhan and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and in particular the laboratory of Professor Ralph Barrick, who was instrumental in enabling the Chinese to conduct what are known as gain-of-function research experiments, which massively increased the infectivity, but not the pathogenicity of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. However it came to enter the West, and I'm saying that carefully because I'm not one of those who thinks that it was a deliberate release. I don't think this was an act of biological warfare, although I'm well aware that all of the laboratories within the Chinese research community, of which Wuhan is the lead, are all dual function. They all have war virus functions as well as civilian biological research functions. And as you may know, the current director of the Wuhan laboratory is herself a major general of the People's Liberation Army and one of the three, I believe, leading figures in the biological warfare program of the PLA. The problem was not in the arrival of the virus, it was in the response of the Western governments to it. By imposing lockdowns on Western societies, which epidemiologically, on the evidence which we had by early 2020, was already quite clearly the wrong course of action to follow. And I'm not saying this being wise after the events. I was party to writing memoranda to the British government in March of 2020, when we had early indication in research with which I was associated with scientists, that at that point, at the civil level of proof, in other words, on the balance of probability, it looked as though the SARS-CoV-2 virus was chimeric in construction, could not have, because of its biochemical construction, could not have emerged by natural evolution. Even at that point, when it was clear that this was a virus that was extremely infectious, and we could explain why, but not very pathogenic, it was only really a risk for people with impaired immune systems and for the aged. Nonetheless, our societies were thrown into lockdown with massive consequences of every possible sort. massive financial consequences by putting economies into deep freeze and shock, massive psychological damage to Generation Z, as it's often called when they were school children, the very children who are now marching weekly in the streets of London or trying to encamp on every campus, it seems, on either of the seaboards of the United States or Chicago, but interestingly, not so much in flyover America. The very children who danced so happily to silly tunes on TikTok, a generation which is in many ways functionally, intellectually illiterate to a degree that is astonishingly worrying and really without precedent because of the manner in which they've been socialized in the electronic age. And I make that just as an observation. We may want to discuss it. I know it's controversial, but I don't claim to have a full explanation for it. I merely observe. But it's a combination of this cultural, historical, social illiteracy with a strong sense of entitlement and self-pitying and unsocialized behavior. It is frankly, ladies and gentlemen, a perfect devil's brew. And we saw it on the campus at Columbia 5 days ago, where we saw, I have her in mind as I say this, a Ph.D. student who was announcing the demands of the students who had broken into one of the halls of residence, which was that the university had to engage in disinvestment from Israel and a whole series of other things. And by the way, had to provide them with hot meals, not cold meals, hot meals and water as essential humanitarian aid, for heaven's sakes, on the Upper West Side of New York, as though these people were somehow living in Gaza. They were in their heads. But these entitled trust babies, I mean, this is a deep, deep worry for us as a society. And it's a sign of how far and how successful, I think, this moral disarmament has gone. Lockdown meant that state socialism in the countries which practiced this lockdown essentially jumped the shark, as it's often said in the United States. It led, as I've observed, to massive state debt, to inflation. It led to great vulnerability to economic attack, which has been redoubled through the agency of so-called net zero, which is a whole other lecture. But this, in conclusion, is multi-theater, multi-modal warfare in the 21st century. It's what we're faced with. And Gaza, I would suggest, proves to be a burning glass that has put the spark in the stubble. Thank you.